I'd spent 4 decades building a life in this country, and when I looked back, there was only one achievement that truly filled me with pride. It wasn't the contracting business I had run for years, and it certainly wasn't the old pickup truck sitting in my driveway. It was the home my wife and I created together on Maple Ridge Lane in Rochester, New York. Every corner of that house carried a memory. The white shutters had been my wife's choice years ago. The front steps were poured by my own hands on a warm Saturday afternoon. And every board, every nail, and every brick reminded me of the thousands of hours I had invested into giving my family a place where they would always feel safe. I knew the sound the front door made on windy autumn evenings, and I could recognize the feel of the porch railing with my eyes closed. That house wasn't just a building, it was the story of my entire life, and I believed it would also be the place where my wife and I would grow old together until the very end. Life, however, has a cruel habit of changing everything when you least expect it. One chilly Thursday evening in October, I turned onto my street after helping an old friend with some work across town. I expected to see the porch lights glowing and smell dinner drifting through the open kitchen window. Instead, I saw my wife standing beside the front gate with a simple canvas shopping bag resting at her feet. She wasn't tending her flowers. She wasn't sitting in her favorite chair on the porch. She was standing perfectly still as the wind swept through her silver hair, and something about her expression immediately told me that the peaceful life we had built was about to be torn apart. My name is Walter Dawson. I'm 64 years old, and I spent more than 3 decades working as a residential construction contractor throughout Western New York before finally retiring. If you want to understand the kind of man I am, let me tell you one small story. On my final day before retirement, my crew organized a celebration for me. While everyone else laughed and enjoyed themselves, I kept worrying whether there would be enough food left for every person who came. That's simply who I've always been. I show up early, I stay until the work is finished, and I never leave a place in worse condition than I found it. I don't know much about complicated investments or clever financial tricks. I've always believed that honest work and keeping your word matter more than anything else. After retirement, my wife Linda and I finally had the chance to enjoy the quiet life we had worked so hard to earn. She had recently retired from teaching elementary school, and for the first time since we were young, neither of us had alarm clocks to answer to or schedules controlling our days. Linda had a remarkable personality. She could silence an entire room with one disappointed glance, yet only moments later have everyone laughing until tears rolled down their faces. She adored gardening and could spend hours caring for flowers most people would never notice. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch her work among the flower beds, convinced there was no greater reward than sharing those peaceful mornings with the woman I loved. We had one child, our son, Ethan. He was 39 and lived outside Buffalo with his wife, Megan. Ethan had built a successful career in real estate, and for years I admired how intelligent and confident he seemed. He always knew exactly what to say to make complicated situations sound simple. Back then, I believed that talent would help him succeed in life. What I failed to recognize was that the same gift could also be used to manipulate people. I never imagined those polished speaking skills would eventually be aimed at his own parents. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were there all along. Like any contractor knows, buildings never collapse without cracks appearing first. The problem is that when the damage involves your own child, you convince yourself those cracks aren't really there. Linda was the heart of our home in every possible way. She believed flowers responded to kindness, and she treated every plant in the yard like it was part of the family. She could spend an entire afternoon trimming damaged leaves or rearranging flower pots until everything looked exactly right. Many evenings, I'd sit quietly on the porch while she worked in the garden, thinking there wasn't another place on earth I'd rather be. That house only became a home because she filled it with warmth. Without her, every room would have been nothing more than walls and furniture. Then, sometime during the previous summer, Ethan started visiting much more often than usual. Before that, we'd mostly see him on holidays or birthdays, but suddenly he began stopping by on ordinary weekdays. At first, it seemed harmless.
He asked casual questions about the cost of maintaining the property. He wondered how much local taxes had increased over the years. One afternoon, while we were relaxing in the backyard, he looked up at the roof and commented that replacing it would probably cost a fortune in today's market. A few minutes later, he asked whether I had ever considered having the house professionally appraised. I laughed and told him there wasn't much point. I never planned to sell the place. As far as I was concerned, this was the home where I intended to spend the rest of my life. Ethan smiled in that polished, professional way he had developed over the years. He said he completely understood and only wanted to make sure Linda and I were making smart financial decisions while the housing market remained strong. I didn't think much about it at the time. A few weeks later, we hosted our annual backyard barbecue. Ethan came with Megan, who also worked in real estate. She carried herself with perfect confidence, always dressed elegantly, always smiling politely, yet something about her eyes made me uneasy. While everyone else talked and enjoyed dinner, she slowly wandered around the property, carefully studying every corner of the yard. She admired the landscaping, complimented the size of the lot, and casually mentioned that maintaining a property this large could eventually become exhausting for people our age. Then she asked Linda if she ever thought about downsizing. Before Linda could answer, I stood up and smiled. I built those front steps myself. They're still straighter than most new ones I've seen. I figure I've got at least another 20 years before mowing this lawn becomes too much work.
Megan forced a polite laugh and immediately changed the subject, but I noticed the brief look she exchanged with Ethan. It lasted only a second, yet it felt like they had been communicating without words. At that moment, I couldn't explain why it bothered me. Looking back now, I realized I had just witnessed the beginning of something much darker. September arrived, and the phone calls became more frequent. Ethan contacted me several times in a single week, always finding a new excuse to bring up the future of the house. Every conversation somehow circled back to long-term planning, property values, estate taxes, or estate management. Each time, I gave him the same answer. "My plan is simple," I told him. "Your mother and I are staying right here." He always agreed politely before ending the conversation, but he never stopped asking. Eventually, he shifted his attention away from me and toward Linda. One afternoon, I drove to the hardware store to pick up supplies for a small repair around the garage. When I returned, Linda mentioned that Ethan had called while I was gone. He hadn't asked how we were doing or whether she needed anything. Instead, he asked whether she had ever spoken with an attorney about putting her name on the property's legal title. Linda simply told him those decisions belonged to the two of us, then offered him one of the cookies she'd baked earlier that morning, before ending the conversation. She smiled while telling me the story, but after 36 years of marriage, I knew exactly when she was hiding concern behind a calm face. I assured her everything was fine. The house had always been legally protected and nothing had changed. She nodded, reached for another cookie, and let the subject drop. At the time, I convinced myself Ethan was simply overthinking everything because of his profession. I believed he was trying too hard to prove how knowledgeable he had become. What I couldn't see was that greed had quietly replaced the values we had spent his entire childhood trying to teach him. As September rolled on, the tension inside our home became impossible to ignore. Every time the phone rang, I had a feeling it would be Ethan. Sure enough, one Thursday evening he called again. This time, he launched into a long explanation about estate planning, tax strategies, and restructuring family assets before it was too late. He used legal phrases I'd never heard before, speaking as though he were giving a business presentation instead of talking to his own father. I finally interrupted him. "Ethan," I said, "you don't need to worry about my finances. I'm still perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." The line went quiet. He didn't argue. He simply wished me a good evening and hung up. That silence stayed with me far longer than the conversation itself. At the time, I thought he was disappointed. Later, I realized he had already decided another approach would work better. While I spent those October days sealing windows, stacking firewood, and preparing the house for winter, my son was preparing something completely different. He was building a lie. He was gathering documents that looked official enough to fool someone who trusted him completely. He was waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike while I wasn't there. That opportunity arrived on a cool Thursday afternoon. I'd driven nearly an hour away to help my longtime friend Harold Pierce move heavy equipment around his workshop.
Harold was 72 years old, stubborn as ever, and refused to hire anyone because he insisted nobody cared about quality anymore. We'd worked side by side for decades, so spending the day helping him felt completely normal. By the time I finished, my shoulders were sore, and my hands carried that familiar ache that always followed a productive day's work. I climbed into my truck feeling satisfied, already thinking about Linda's cooking and the quiet evening waiting for me at home. I turned onto Maple Ridge Lane just after 6 o'clock. Normally, I could see warm light spilling from the living room windows before I even reached the driveway. That evening, everything felt different. Linda wasn't in the flower beds. She wasn't sitting on the porch with her knitting. She was standing beside the front gate. A worn canvas grocery bag rested beside her feet. I pulled the truck over immediately. The moment I stepped out, I looked into her face and felt my stomach tighten. She looked frightened, not confused, not upset, truly frightened. She whispered my name so softly I almost didn't hear it. Walter. That single word told me everything. The uneasiness that had followed me for months had finally become reality. Without asking another question, I already knew Ethan had been there. Whatever he had done while I was away had shaken the strongest woman I'd ever known. I walked towards her without raising my voice. I didn't panic. I simply reached for her hand. It was freezing. "Let's go inside," I said gently. Instead of moving, she slowly shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "Ethan said we aren't allowed to be here anymore." For a brief moment, I couldn't even breathe. Then I looked directly into her eyes. "This house is ours," I said firmly. "It has always been ours. Nobody, not even our own son, has the right to tell you otherwise." She searched my face as though she wanted to believe me but couldn't. I picked up the grocery bag with one hand and wrapped my other arm around her shoulders. "We're going inside," I said gently. "And then you're going to tell me exactly what happened." She nodded without saying another word. As we walked through the front door, I noticed how hesitant she was. She stepped into the living room like someone entering a stranger's house. That sight hurt me more than I can describe. I carried the grocery bag into the kitchen and placed it on the table. Inside were only a few changes of clothes, her favorite sweater, and an old family photo album. Nothing else. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. My own son had convinced his mother that those few belongings were all she had the right to take from the life we'd spent 40 years building together. I forced myself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help Linda. She needed reassurance. I poured her a glass of water. Then I cut a slice of the lemon pound cake she'd baked the day before and placed it in front of her. She barely looked at it.
I sat across the table, gently held her trembling hands, and spoke as quietly as I could. "Linda, I need you to tell me everything." Linda took a slow breath before she began speaking. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and every sentence sounded as though it cost her tremendous effort. Ethan had arrived shortly after lunch. Megan had come with him. They hadn't come to visit. They hadn't come to check on us. They had walked through our front door carrying a thick folder filled with documents. According to Linda, the papers looked completely authentic. There were official-looking seals, signatures, legal formatting, and every page appeared professional enough to convince someone who had never dealt with legal paperwork before. Ethan calmly placed the folder on the kitchen table and told her the ownership of the house had already been transferred into his name. He explained that it was part of a long-term estate plan. He claimed I had approved everything weeks earlier. Then he told her I was away finishing the final paperwork with an attorney. That lie cut deeper than anything else. He hadn't simply forged documents. He had used Linda's trust in me as the weapon that made his story believable. She asked him why I hadn't mentioned any of this to her. Without hesitation, he smiled and told her we had wanted to surprise her so she wouldn't worry about the complicated legal process. Then he started throwing around words like transition, estate restructuring, asset protection, and ownership transfer. Linda admitted she barely understood any of it. She only knew her own son sounded completely confident. Whenever she questioned something, Ethan pointed back to the paperwork as though the documents alone proved he was telling the truth.
Meanwhile, Megan wandered through the house, almost like an appraiser inspecting a property before listing it for sale. She examined the china cabinet. She pulled back the curtains to look outside. She commented on the hardwood floors. She even measured part of the living room wall with the measuring tape she carried in her purse. Linda said it felt less like they were visiting family and more like strangers evaluating a building they believed already belonged to them. Then everything changed. Ethan looked directly at his mother and quietly told her it would be better if she packed a few personal belongings before I returned. He claimed the transition would be easier if she cooperated. He insisted nobody wanted an unpleasant confrontation. Linda asked where she was supposed to go. He simply shrugged. He said we'd figure something out later. As she told me those words, tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. "I didn't want to make things harder for you," she whispered. "I thought maybe you really had agreed to this." My heart broke. The woman who had stood beside me through every difficult year of our marriage had doubted herself because our own son had manipulated the trust she placed in both of us. She explained that she grabbed the old canvas grocery bag because it was the first thing she saw near the pantry. She packed one sweater, a few clothes, some medication, and the family photo album because she couldn't bear the thought of leaving those memories behind. Then she walked outside. She didn't even lock the front door. She believed she no longer had the right to use her own key. For nearly an hour, she stood beside the front gate waiting for me to come home. She never once stepped back inside. Listening to her describe those 60 minutes felt almost unbearable. The cruelty wasn't about the house. It wasn't even about money anymore. Ethan had stripped away his own mother's sense of belonging. He had made her feel like a trespasser inside the home where she had raised him. I slowly stood from the table. Every part of me was burning with anger, but I refused to let Linda see it. She had already been frightened enough for one day. Without saying another word, I walked into the hallway, took my phone from my jacket pocket, and dialed the only person I trusted to handle something this serious. Her name was Victoria Reynolds. She had been my attorney for more than a decade. She was 53 years old, incredibly sharp, and possessed the kind of calm authority that made people listen the moment she began speaking. She answered before the second ring. "Walter, what's happened?" I told her everything exactly as Linda had described it. No exaggeration, no emotion, just the facts. When I finished, there was silence on the line for several long seconds. Finally, Victoria spoke. "Walter, the deed to your home has always been in your name alone." Her voice was steady. "I would know immediately if anyone had legally transferred ownership. No such transfer has ever occurred." I closed my eyes. "So those documents, they're fraudulent," she replied without hesitation. "And if your son knowingly presented them as genuine, he's created a far more serious problem for himself than he realizes." For the first time since I had arrived home, my anger found direction. "What do we do now?" I asked quietly. Victoria didn't hesitate. "You don't do anything tonight. I'll take care of the legal side. Starting tomorrow, we're going to remind your son that forged paperwork doesn't outweigh the law." After I ended the call, I remained standing in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the family photographs hanging on the wall. There was Ethan, at 5 years old, grinning proudly while holding the tiny birdhouse we'd built together one Saturday morning. There he was again at 12, covered in sawdust after insisting he wanted to help me build a backyard shed. Every picture reminded me of the boy I thought I had raised. I couldn't reconcile those memories with the man who had convinced his own mother to leave her home, carrying nothing more than a grocery bag. When I returned to the kitchen, Linda looked at me with tired eyes, searching my face for answers. "What did Victoria say?" she asked quietly. I pulled out the chair beside her instead of sitting across the table this time. "She said the house is exactly where it's always been, in my name. Nothing has changed. Those papers Ethan showed you were never legitimate." Linda closed her eyes and slowly released the breath she'd been holding. "So, we aren't losing our home?" I gently squeezed her hand. "We're not losing anything." For the first time that evening, I saw a small amount of color return to her face. She leaned against my shoulder, and neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence wasn't uncomfortable.
We simply needed time to absorb what had happened. Later that night, Victoria called me again. "I've already started preparing the paperwork," she said. "By tomorrow morning, Ethan will receive a formal notice making it absolutely clear that he has no legal authority over your property." She paused before continuing. "And Walter, after everything you've told me, I believe what he did goes far beyond poor judgment. Presenting forged documents to intimidate someone to surrendering possession of a home may carry serious legal consequences." Her words were calm, but their meaning couldn't have been clearer. Ethan had crossed a line that couldn't simply be explained away as a misunderstanding. After thanking her, I ended the call. Even then, sleep refused to come. Around 10 o'clock, I stepped onto the front porch with a blanket draped over my shoulders. The October air was cool, and the neighborhood had already gone quiet. I looked across the yard toward the front gate where Linda had been standing only a few hours earlier. That image refused to leave my mind. The woman who had spent decades making that house a home had honestly believed she no longer belonged there. I sat there for nearly 40 minutes before deciding to call someone who had known me almost my entire adult life. His name was Michael Harper. We had worked together for nearly 30 years, and there wasn't another friend whose opinion I trusted more. He answered almost immediately. "Michael, everything okay?" "No," I admitted. Then I told him the entire story. He didn't interrupt once. When I finally finished, the line remained silent. Not the awkward silence of someone unsure what to say, the heavy silence of a father imagining the same thing happening in his own family. Finally, he spoke. "He told Linda to leave?" "Yes." "With a grocery bag?" "Yes." Michael sighed deeply. "I honestly don't know what to say." "Neither do I." After another long pause, he asked if I was holding up all right. I looked toward the backyard where the old oak tree cast long shadows across the fence. "I will be," I answered. "Tomorrow." He let out a quiet laugh. "I've known you a long time. Whenever you say tomorrow like that, it usually means someone has made a terrible mistake. This time, they really have." He wished me luck before hanging up. When I walked back inside, Linda was still sitting at the kitchen table. The slice of lemon cake remained untouched. "I kept thinking you'd come through that door," she whispered. "I should have been here." She slowly shook her head. "You've always been here." Those 5 words hurt more than anything Ethan had done. Because she was right. I had always protected my family. And somehow, despite all my experience recognizing weak foundations in a hidden damage, I had failed to see what was happening inside my own family until it nearly destroyed the person I loved most. That night, neither of us slept. Linda eventually went upstairs, but I remained in the living room watching the clock move minute by minute. Midnight. 2 o'clock. 4 o'clock. Every passing hour brought Friday morning closer. By dawn, Victoria would have everything in motion. And for the first time in nearly 24 hours since Ethan walked into our home carrying those fake documents, the advantage would no longer belong to him. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. I was already awake before sunrise, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Linda eventually came downstairs wearing the same sweater she had packed into that grocery bag the day before. Seeing her in that made my chest tighten all over again. She smiled faintly. "You didn't sleep either, did you?" I shook my head. "There are some nights when sleep just isn't possible." She reached for my hand, and for a few quiet minutes, neither of us said anything. We simply watched the sunlight slowly fill the kitchen. The house felt peaceful again, but beneath that calm was the certainty that our lives had changed forever. At exactly 7:30, my phone buzzed. It was Victoria. "I've finished everything," she said. "The formal notice has been reviewed and approved. A process server is on the way." She explained that Ethan would officially receive legal notice that morning. The document made one thing clear. He has absolutely no ownership rights over the property, and he's prohibited from entering our land without permission. If he ignored that warning, he would be responsible for whatever legal consequences followed. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, I felt like justice had finally begun moving in the right direction. At a little after 8, Victoria called again. "It's done," she said simply. "He has it?" "She has it." I thanked her before ending the call.
I had barely set my phone down when it started vibrating again. Ethan. I watched his name appear on the screen. I let it ring. A few minutes later, he called again. This time, I answered. "Dad," he said immediately, his voice unsteady. "What is this? Someone just served me legal papers. There has to be some mistake." I didn't interrupt him. I let him keep talking. He stumbled through excuses about misunderstandings, long-term planning, and trying to help us. Only after he finally ran out of words did I respond. "Ethan, I want you to think about something before we discuss anything else." He became quiet. "Yesterday, your mother stood outside her own home holding a grocery bag because you convinced her she no longer belonged there."
The kind that comes after realizing the truth has caught up with them. He cleared his throat. "Dad, I wasn't trying to hurt Mom." "No? No. I was only trying to help you both prepare for the future." I spoke calmly. "You prepared forged documents. You lied to your mother. Dad, listen. You told her I had secretly agreed to give you our home. It wasn't like... It was exactly like that." He stopped talking. I continued. "Victoria confirmed everything. The deed has never left my name. There has never been a transfer. Every single thing you told your mother was false." Another long silence. Finally, he spoke. "I thought eventually you'd understand." Those words surprised me more than anything else. He still believed his intentions somehow justified everything he'd done. "No," I answered quietly. "What I understand is that you frightened your own mother so badly she packed a grocery bag and waited outside for me because she believed she'd lost her home." His breathing became heavier. "I never thought she'd actually leave, but she did." I paused before continuing. "And that's something you will have to live with." He tried changing the conversation. He insisted he had only been thinking about protecting family assets. He claimed he was worried we wouldn't be able to maintain the property as we grew older. I let him finish. Then I said something he clearly wasn't expecting. "You don't get to decide when your mother and I are finished living our lives." Silence. "You also don't get to manipulate us into making that decision." His voice became much quieter. "So, what happens now?" The notice already answered that question. "Dad, you are no longer welcome on this property unless your mother and I invite you." Another silence followed, one much longer than the others. Finally, in a voice I barely recognized, he asked, "Are you really doing this?" I looked through the kitchen window toward the flower beds Linda had planted over the years. "No," I answered. "You did this yesterday." Without another word, I ended the call. For several seconds, I simply stood there holding the phone. Then I placed it on the kitchen counter. A strange sense of peace settled over me, not because I'd won, because the truth had finally replaced the lies. Linda walked over quietly. She didn't ask what Ethan had said. She only wrapped her arms around me. For the first time since everything had happened, our house truly felt like home again. The following Monday, I drove to Victoria Reynolds' office just after 9 in the morning. The sky was bright and clear, but I wasn't there to admire the weather. I was there to make sure there would be never another opportunity for greed to threaten the life Linda and I had built together. Victoria greeted me with a firm handshake before leading me into her office. A thick stack of documents was already waiting on her desk. "I thought you might come in today," she said. I wasn't going to wait. She gave a slight smile. "I didn't think you would." For the next 2 hours, we carefully reviewed every document connected to my estate, my property, and my future wishes. After everything that had happened, I wasn't willing to leave a single opening that could ever be exploited again. Finally, Victoria looked up from the last folder. "There's one question you need to answer." I already knew what it was. What happens to Ethan's inheritance?
The room became completely silent. This wasn't a decision I had made out of anger. I'd spent the entire weekend thinking about it. A parent hopes their child will someday appreciate the sacrifices made for them, but appreciation cannot be forced, and trust cannot survive deliberate betrayal. "I want the documents changed," I said quietly. Victoria studied my face for a moment. "Are you certain?" "Completely." Without another question, she reached for another folder. "I already prepared the amendment," she admitted. "I suspected this might be your decision." I couldn't help smiling for the first time in days. "You always seem to be one step ahead." She learned that preparation solves most problems. Within half an hour, every necessary signature had been completed. When I walked out of her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I had taken something away from my son, because I had protected the future Linda and I still intended to enjoy together. That evening, Linda and I ate dinner on the back porch as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. After clearing the dishes, I finally told her about the changes I had made. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked toward the flower garden she'd spent years caring for. For several moments, she didn't say anything. Finally, she turned back toward me. "Was that really what you wanted?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "He stopped being the little boy we raised the moment he stood in this kitchen and tried to take our home through deception." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I never wanted it to come to this." "I know." She looked down at our joined hands. "What hurt the most wasn't the house." "I know." It was seeing our own son look at us like we were obstacles instead of family. Neither of us spoke again for a while. The breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the yard, and for the first time in days, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. That Saturday afternoon, my longtime friend Michael stopped by carrying a homemade coffee cake. He insisted his daughter had baked it. Linda laughed the moment she tasted it. "Michael, you've been making this recipe for 20 years. He grinned. "I might have helped a little." The three of us spent most of the afternoon sitting on the porch drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood go about its usual routine. At one point, Linda went inside to make another pot of tea. Michael leaned toward me. "How are you really doing?" I looked out across the backyard. The oak tree had already dropped most of its leaves, and they had collected neatly along the fence just as they did every October. Linda had reminded me several times that they needed to be raked. "I'll clean them up tomorrow," I said. Michael chuckled. "I wasn't asking about the leaves." I smiled. "I know." He waited. I thought about everything that had happened over the past week. The fear on Linda's face, the grocery bag, the fake documents, the phone call, the legal notice. Everything. Then I answered honestly. "I'm better than I expected." Michael nodded. "I figured you would be." "Why?" "Because men like you don't heal by talking." I laughed quietly. "We heal by fixing what's broken." He raised his coffee cup. "That's exactly what you've done." A few minutes later, Linda returned with fresh tea. She looked happier than she had in weeks. She smiled easily. She laughed without forcing it. Most importantly, she looked like a woman who never once believed she needed permission to enter her own home. Seeing that was worth more to me than any courtroom victory ever could. Over the years, I've learned that kindness and weakness are often confused, but they're nothing alike. You should always treat people with compassion, but never allow anyone to mistake your generosity for permission to take advantage of you. A strong foundation doesn't fail because of one heavy storm. It fails when small cracks are ignored for too long. Families are no different. Trust must be protected just as carefully as any home you've spent a lifetime building. If someone you love chooses dishonesty over integrity, allowing them to face the consequences isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the only lesson that still has a chance of changing them. Today, Linda and I still live in the same house on Maple Ridge Lane. The porch steps remain solid. The front door still creaks whenever the autumn wind blows. The flower beds are once again full of color because Linda never stopped caring for them. And every evening, when I sit beside the woman I love, I'm reminded that a home isn't defined by paperwork or property values. It's defined by the people who protect it. Thanks for being part of today's story. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories of family, betrayal, justice, and unforgettable endings.